So the Cold War ends, right? And almost overnight, the old map we used to understand global power is completely useless. What comes next? Well, one of the most powerful, and definitely one of the most controversial answers, came from a political scientist named Samuel P. Huntington. He basically proposed a whole new map for the world, one that wasn't based on politics or ideology, but on something much older, a clash of civilizations.
To really get what Huntington was talking about, we have to go back in time to the early 1990s. This was a moment of incredible uncertainty. All the old rules we thought we knew about how the world worked, they were just gone.
I mean, think about it. For almost half a century, the entire world was seen as bipolar. Everything, and I mean everything, was understood through the lens of the US versus the Soviet Union. And then it just ended. That left this huge void, this intellectual vacuum. How on earth were we supposed to make sense of the world now? Now, before the Cold War, the world map was defined by a totally different kind of power. For centuries, global politics was pretty straightforward in a way. It was basically the West and the rest, with Western nations expanding, colonizing, and shaping pretty much every other part of the globe. And that eventually evolved into the world a lot of us are more familiar with, the Cold War map. Here, the big split wasn't about colonial power anymore, it was about ideology. You had the democratic West, the communist East, and then this third world of nations that tried not to pick a side. It was a simple, powerful way to see the world that lasted for decades.
But after 1990, poof, that ideological map became totally useless. And this is the exact problem Huntington was trying to solve. He argued that we were walking into a brand new phase of history, a world that was now multipolar, meaning lots of centers of power, and, this is the key part, multi-civilizational.
So, this brings us to the central question that his whole theory tries to answer. If those old divisions, capitalism versus communism, East versus West, were fading away, what was going to take their place? What are the new lines that bring people together, and what are the new lines that will tear them apart? Huntington's answer to that question was, well, it was radical, and it completely shook up the world of international relations. He basically argued that the future of global conflict wasn't going to be about politics or economics anymore, but about culture. This quote right here, this is the absolute core of his whole argument. He predicted that these fault lines between civilizations were going to become the central lines of conflict in global politics. In other words, the biggest fights in the world wouldn't be about who has what ideology, but about who you are, culturally speaking. So let's boil it down. His argument is that for the first time in history, global politics has become truly multi-civilizational, and there's a fascinating reason why. Huntington argued that as societies modernize, they don't just automatically become like the West. Actually, the opposite often happens. Modernization can trigger a massive resurgence of a country's own culture. People start to define themselves less by their political party and more by their roots, their ancestry, their religion, their language, their traditions. Now, to really understand this, we have to get a handle on his main building block, this idea of a civilization. So what exactly is a civilization? Huntington defines it as the biggest we you can belong to. It's the broadest level of cultural identity you can have. You might be French or German, but you're also a Westerner. You can't really get any bigger than that without just saying you're a human being. So with that idea, Huntington laid out his new map of the world. He identified what he believed were the major civilizations that were active today. You've got Sinic, or Chinese, Japanese, Hindu, Islamic, Orthodox, and Western. And then he also included Latin American and, as a possibility, an emerging African civilization. These are the huge cultural blocks he thought would shape everything that was about to happen. So what's the glue that holds these giant groups together? Well, it's things you'd expect, like a shared language, history, and customs. But for Huntington, the single most important factor, the absolute bedrock of any civilization, is religion. Okay, so if the world is made up of these massive cultural teams, what happens when they start bumping into each other? And that question brings us to the most famous and, the most fiercely debated part of his whole theory, the clash itself. You can really see the shift he was talking about here. The Cold War was a fight between ideas, right? Capitalism versus communism. But this new era, he predicted, was going to be defined by cultural clashes between these major civilizations.
He called the borders where these civilizations physically meet fault lines, and it's a great analogy. Think of them like the tectonic plates of the Earth, constantly grinding against each other. This, he said, is where the conflicts of the future were going to spark.
And this wasn't just some abstract idea. He pointed to real-world examples. He argued that conflicts in places like Bosnia, Chechnya, and Kashmir weren't random at all. They were happening precisely on these civilizational fault lines. In the former Yugoslavia, for example, you literally had Orthodox, Western, and Islamic civilizations all clashing in one place. He also predicted bigger, macro-level clashes between the West and other major players, especially the Islamic world and China.
But here's where it gets even more dangerous. The clashes don't always stay local. Huntington predicted this powerful effect he called kin-country rallying. The idea is that when a conflict breaks out on one of these fault lines, other countries from the same civilization will rally to support their cultural family. And that's how a small, local fight can suddenly blow up into a major global crisis. The wars in Yugoslavia were a perfect and chilling example of this, with Russia backing the Orthodox Serbs, while countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia backed the Bosnian Muslims.
So, this was written decades ago. Why are we still talking about this book? What gives it such staying power?
Well, this is a really important point to get. Huntington himself insisted that he wasn't making some ironclad prophecy about an inevitable world war. He was offering a paradigm. It's basically a simplified map, a new lens to help us look at a really messy and complicated world and hopefully make a little more sense of it.
And in his own words, the value of his theory wasn't about being right 100% of the time. The real test was simply this. Is this map more useful than any of the other maps out there? Is it better than pretending we're all just one big, happy, global family, or that it's just every country for itself?
And the truth is, it has stuck around. Now, make no mistake, the theory has been intensely criticized for oversimplifying complex cultures and maybe even creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. But here's the thing. Whether you think it's a brilliant insight or a dangerous oversimplification, the clash of civilizations is still a foundational idea. You either build on it or you have to argue against it. You can't just ignore it.
Which leaves us with that big, provocative question at the very heart of Huntington's work. When you look at the world today, what do you see? Are we all slowly moving toward one single universal civilization? Or are those ancient cultural fault lines that have divided us for centuries reemerging as the single most important feature of our time?